So Peter is a researcher with the Antarctic Institute of Canada and a medical student at the University of Alberta. He holds a Master of Science in Pediatric and honors in pediatrics and honors Bachelor of Science in Physiology from the University of Alberta. He's the president of the Canadian Coalition for Global Health Research, Students and Young Professionals Network, the University of Alberta chapter. And he has previously been recognized for his research achievements, having been named one of the Alberta Council of Global Cooperation's top 30 under 30 in 2019. So I'm looking forward to hearing your talk, and please go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you, Joel, for that excellent introduction. And thank you to all of the conference organizers for this opportunity. Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining my presentation. Today, I'll be shedding some light on the effects of sunlight exposure during pregnancy at different latitudes around the world on the health of the offspring. And just as a disclaimer, I will apologize in advance for any of the unintended and intended puns throughout this presentation. So before I begin, I have no disclosures to declare. Vitamin D deficiency in pregnant mothers is an increasingly prevalent global health concern in many parts of the world. In fact, rates of up to 60% are reported in developing regions such as Tunisia, parts of Africa, parts of India, and the Middle East, where there is a low availability of vitamin D in diet and a lack of access to supplements. Now, it is widely recognized that UV rays in sunlight can activate the vitamin D synthesis pathway, and that it can also have adverse carcinogenic effects if prolonged. However, there has yet to be any international or national guidelines on how much sunlight exposure is therapeutic. This is predominantly because the role of sunlight during pregnancy on the fetus is poorly understood, and quite ironically, a body of knowledge that still remains in the dark. So therefore, the objectives of this scoping review were to first examine the current evidence on how sunlight exposure during pregnancy influences outcomes at birth and in the long term, and secondly, to contrive public health policy recommendations using a qualitative and narrative synthesis. Now, to accomplish these objectives, we followed the PRISMA guidelines for scoping reviews to conduct a scoping review utilizing Medline, Embase, and Google Scholar databases. Our inclusion criteria included primary research articles, case studies, systematic reviews, and meta-analysis, whereas our exclusion criteria were research with maternal health as its primary outcome, animal studies, and in vitro studies. So in brief, we screened over 3,000 titles, and after removing duplicates and screening for the full text eligibility, 14 studies were obtained. Now, all 14 studies examined associations with a total of 5 retrospective, 4 longitudinal, 3 cross-sectional, and 2 prospective studies. And of the 14, there were 5 Australian and New Zealand studies, 4 European, 3 North American, 1 Asian, and 1 African study. And in addition, 8 of them were related to the immediate outcomes at birth, and 6 of them were related to the long-term outcomes at birth. After birth. Now, the results are promising, but nonetheless, the evidence is still in its embryonic stages. 5 out of 8 studies demonstrated an association between sunlight exposure and reduced adverse birth outcomes, including low birth weight, small size for gestational age, and preterm birth. On the other hand, 2 out of 8 of the studies showed no association, and 1 study actually showed a negative association with these outcomes. In terms of the chronic outcomes in childhood, the evidence was scarce and also still in its early stages, but sunlight exposure was demonstrated to be associated with skeletal growth and development and reduced incidence of multiple sclerosis, asthma, and pneumonia. Now, a recurring concept in these studies was the timing of sunlight exposure, whether this be seasonal, geographical, or physiological exposure differences during a specific gestational phase. The results of this study suggested the lack of exposure during these critical trimesters had a greater risk for diseases associated with developmental programming, during its respective stage. For instance, it is well established that the majority of the nervous system develops in the first trimester. And in one Australian study, it was the offsprings whose mothers' first trimester overlap with the winter months were shown to be at a higher risk of developing nervous system related conditions like multiple sclerosis. Incidentally, a similar association was noted with lower exposures to sunlight in the second trimester, which is implicated in lung development and the risk of asthma in childhood in an American study. Now, in light of this, health policymakers around the world should consider exposure therapies that target these trimesters. Now, many of these studies also suggested alternative mechanisms of action for sunlight, which can occur either independently or in combination with the vitamin D synthesis pathways. For example, in the sunlight serotonin pathway, it was proposed exposure to sunlight can affect the amounts of serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter implicated in regulating mood and low levels. And typically these are associated with seasonal affective disorder, which can affect the mother's psychological well-being and perhaps indirectly affect the developing embryo or fetus. Now, another major consideration was epidemiology. So with only one study from the Asian and African subcontinent, it is difficult to validate outcomes in these regions. And it really suggests that need for greater research in those areas. And differences in geography can contribute to differences in exposure with regions, where we can see regions such as Iqaluit up north getting less than half an hour of daylight in the winter, and Ivory Coast and regions around Ghana receiving up to 13 hours of sunlight in the summer. There are also racial and genetic differences. For instance, non-Hispanic Black mothers have been shown to have lower adverse birth outcomes compared to non-Hispanic Caucasian mothers. Finally, behavioral and socioeconomic factors such as access to sunscreen, type of home or habitat, and kinds of clothing one must or chooses to wear can influence the level of exposure that the mother receives. Now, in light of this, recommendations must target these genetic, environmental, and behavioral factors. And there should also be regional level, province or state level, and national or international scale policies that are formulated by consulting an interdisciplinary team of experts. Now, to summarize, on the bright side, our results suggest sunlight exposure may indeed be implicated in the proper development during pregnancy, impacting both the acute and long-term health of the offspring. And as a result, the policies can focus on exposure therapies, focused on trimester targeting, mechanisms of action, and epidemiological factors. However, it is significant to realize that we only reviewed associations in this scoping review, and that we still require further studies to shed more light on these effects, specifically in vitamin D deficient regions such as South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, where research is still very scarce. And before I conclude this presentation, I'd just like to acknowledge that this research would not have been possible without the support of our funding agencies and collaborators. And finally, I can open the floor for any questions.